All right, everybody, welcome back to section 4 of Comparative Criminology, and today we're going to be talking about, or beginning our discussion of policing in a comparative context. So, first thing we got to do is talk about what is the job of police, right? And one of the, I've talked to a lot of police officers in my life, in many different countries, in fact, and one of the overarching themes that I get from talking to police officers is we're asked to do a million different things. We're trained for some of them, but some of them we have no training for, and we never know what we're going to get every time we leave the police station. So the job of the police has changed a lot over the past few hundred years. And it changes continuously based on time, based on place, based on lots of different things. But some of the more common things we ask the police to do are A, proactive crime prevention. We want them to stop crime before that crime happens. We want them to be out and about, patrolling, making sure nobody's snatching purses or robbing liquor stores. Then we want them to do reactive crime solving, which is a very, very different process. This is where the crime has already happened. We want you to figure out who did it and go and arrest them. And then, of course, there's the non-criminal matters. Everything from helping kids get kittens out of trees, which is, I know, traditionally the job of fire departments, but to helping us give directions, to solving marital disputes, reporting fires. They're out and about doing all kinds of things that we kind of have grown to expect them to do. Now, that's in a perfect world, right? But we don't always live in a perfect world. So in more authoritarian or totalitarian states, they are less used to help the people. They don't serve and protect the people. They serve and protect the power of the state, the country, the people in power, up to and including the use of torture on political opponents. Unfortunately, we've seen this time after time after time all over the world. There were many South and Central American countries where this happened in the 80s and 90s, Asian countries, Middle Eastern countries, African countries. All over the world, even in Europe and North America, we've had issues of the police working for the government, working for those in power, and against kind of the popular will of the people, again, up to and including torturing. And usually, when a dictatorship is overthrown and a new, hopefully, knock on wood, democratic government put in there by the people is installed, one of the big issues they have, in many cases, is reforming the police. Because they don't, when a new government comes in, the dictatorship is overthrown, new government comes in, they don't just fire all the police officers and start over from scratch. There are lots of the police officers from the old regime that stay on and continue to be police officers under this new, again, hopefully democratic government put in by the people. But they can't just completely change their entire philosophy on policing overnight. So it can be very difficult to take a police force from a dictatorship to a non-dictatorship. Now, again, policing, they have numerous contradictory, in many cases, demands, right? Like, we want you to be in our neighborhoods more, but we want you to arrest the people from our neighborhood less. Like, those are kind of contradictory demands. We want you to be there to call in when a husband and wife are fighting, but husbands and wives fightings are matters for the family, and they shouldn't, the aggressor should not be arrested. Police are often put in kind of a no-win situation. And that's kind of unfortunate, but it happens all the time. Um, there's lots of variation across time and geography. For instance, here in the United States, kind of the beginnings of our law enforcement are unfortunately rooted in slavery. The slave catching patrols that would go around trying to catch runaway slaves were some of the first police organizations here in the United States. And so their kind of job was much different than we think of police today. And then there's a giant divide between rural and urban policing, right? In urban policing, there's lots and lots and lots of people in a very small space. And the social ills in that situation and the job of police are as much different than in an area that is way more rural. I'm a big fan of those kind of true cop shows like Cops and Live PD and all those. And I remember watching one where there was an officer in rural Alaska, and he was like, my nearest backup is an hour and a half away. So if I get in trouble, I got to wait an hour and a half for somebody to come help me. And in rural, similarly, urban police very rarely have to deal with bears and moose and wildlife situations of a large nature, whereas in rural policing that can be a very common everyday occurrence. So the job is very, very different depending on what kind of area you can live in. And policy seems to kind of migrate from place to place to place, right? So here in the United States, a lot of times there will be a few states or locations that start doing something, and then pretty soon most of the police departments across the United States are doing it, right? And there's two different ways that happens. The first is policy transfer, which is where one department or one country or one state says, oh, they're doing it this way, it seems to be working, let's do it like that. So it's kind of an on purpose, we're going to copy what they're doing. Policy diffusion is essentially the same process, but subconscious. And I gave the example a couple sections ago of police uniforms, right? So because of the American media making the American police uniform, or kind of the in general what American police, because they wear many different uniforms, but they have very similar aspects. And now in many other countries all over the world, police uniforms look very, very similar to that. In most cases, that wasn't a conscious choice. They didn't say, oh, we should make our police uniforms look like American police uniforms. It was just they had been inundated with American media, and so subconsciously they were like, oh, this is what a police officer uniform is supposed to look like. So in both cases, policies are spreading from one or a few areas into others. Policy transfer is when it's a conscious choice. Diffusion is when it's just kind of a subconscious, oh, we're going to do it that way because that's the way it's supposed to happen. Now, patrol. One of the kind of demands on police is we want you to patrol. We want you to just be out and about, walking or driving or using some other kind of vehicle to just walk around, talk to people, be there as a deterrent. So if a bad guy's like, oh, I should rob this 7-Eleven, but then a police car drives down the street, they're going to think twice about actually robbing that convenience store. That's great in theory. Unfortunately, a lot of the data we have says it doesn't work that way. Now, there was a famous experiment back in the, I want to say early 70s, but don't quote me on that. Sometime, I think it was maybe late 70s. Anyway, it's called the Kansas City Preventive Patrol Experiment. They took the entire city of Kansas City and divided it into a bunch of different little small chunks. And each one of these chunks was assigned a number, 1, 2, or 3. And I can't remember which one was which, but it was something like in section 1, police patrolled as normal. Whatever they would have done before the experiment, they continued to do. In section 2, they doubled patrol, way more patrol, tons and tons of police, tons and tons of police cars, lots of patrolling. And in section 3, they didn't patrol at all. They only responded to calls. They went out, responded to calls, and when they were done with that, they went back to the police station to wait for the next call. And what they found was crime really didn't change depending on which one of those three types of section you were in. The increased patrol didn't have increased or decreased crime the way they predicted, and the zero patrol didn't have increased crime like they predicted. Now, subsequent studies have both supported and not supported that situation, but there is a lot of evidence that patrol might not do what we kind of all assume it does, and what society and communities have asked that they do. Might not actually be doing what those groups want it to do. Now, police shootings. Obviously, the ultimate power of police is that they, in a lot of cases, have the power of life and death on behalf of the state. We give them the power to take life in most countries because we trust them to do it the right way. Unfortunately, this isn't always the case. There are a lot of police shootings around the world that are not justified. One of the scariest things as an American is that here in the United States, we have no good data on how many police shootings happen. There are no official statistics for the entire country about how many police fire their weapon in the line of duty. Now, a few departments put out data, but there is no good collection on police shootings the way there is about homicide and car theft and other crimes where we do have good national data. So the Guardian newspaper, which if you know anything about news, the Guardian is a British newspaper, started tracking police shootings. They would, because police shootings tend to make the news, whether it's newspapers or television news in the United States, they started tracking all the ones they could find from newspapers, from local and national news, started tracking all of them. And what they found was really pretty disturbing. And the most disturbing part, at least in my mind, was the heavy, heavy, heavy influence of race on whether somebody got shot or not. African Americans are much, much, much more likely to be shot, or at least shot at, by police than Caucasian people. So, even controlling for size of the population and amount of crimes reported and number of, their percentage as suspects, there's a heavy influence of race on whether someone is likely to be shot by police or not. Now, how many police do we have in each country or in each region or in each city? Usually, these ratios are done per 100,000 people, right? So if a city has 300,000 people, we take their number of police officers and divide by 3, and that's how many they have per 100,000, right? So looking at that kind of standardizes police per population rather than just sheer number of police. Because if you only look at number of police, then of course places with more people are going to have more police. But looking at just very large areas and their police to population ratios, in Africa it's under 200. A lot of countries it's in the 100, 150, 160 kind of range. North America, about 200. Both the United States and Canada right around the 200 per 100,000 people mark. In Europe, South America, and Asia, it's about 300. So they have a lot more police per population than they do I should say we do here in North America. And in the Middle East, it's over 400 per 100,000. So there's a few kind of overall lessons here. One, or I shouldn't say lessons, I should say things that come to mind that might help explain the differences here. In Africa, obviously they don't have a lot of resources in many places. They've been exploited for so long, only recently gained independence, on the long-term scale. So they don't have, in a lot of cases, enough resources to hire many police officers. Um, in North America, we have fewer than they do in the other Western areas and Asia, um, and that might be due to the fact that we're a lot more spread out compared to, say, Western Europe and East Asia. It could be a lot of things. And in the Middle East, they have so many because in many cases, Middle Eastern countries are more authoritarian. They want the police there to protect the power of the state against things like the Arab Spring, which we saw a few years ago. They want more police in order to kind of maintain an order that, again, not all cases, but in many cases, the people are very much against. So again, these are very, very broad areas with lots of different countries in them, and there are, even within each category, there's wild variation on these numbers. So if you look at Asia, there's going to be a vast difference between the police population ratio in Mongolia versus Japan, right? So, policing styles. Wright talked about 4 different kind of policing styles based on the militarization of police, i.e., what's the difference between the police and the military? Now, it's kind of a sliding scale. So these aren't 4 kind of distinct things. These are 4 kind of points that Wright picked out upon this large gradient. And at one end, we have the civil police. These are, completely non-militarized, very, very different both in organization and structure and equipment and mission and tactics, all those things. At the other end of the slide, we have martial law, where there essentially is no difference between the police and the military. If there is a difference, it's really a name only, and the personnel can be switched back and forth. And then, of course, there's the kind of middle areas where police are getting slightly more militarized or slightly less militarized. But it really is kind of a continuum with police and the military being totally separate in all respects on one end, and police and the military being essentially the same on the other. And where your country fits, or even your city, can vary a lot based on all kinds of things, from time to what country you're in to all these other kind of issues. Now, there's also many different policing styles based on kind of how they see their job, how they do their job, what their focus is. And I'm just going to talk about 2 of the major ones, okay? There's many, if you talk to different criminologists, they're going to tell you there's 5 different policing styles, or 2 different policing styles, or 20, or whatever. But 2 of the biggest ones, 2 of the more common ones that criminologists tends to talk about and categorize groups into. The first one is community policing. This is where the police member is really kind of integrated into the community. They're less, just there when you need them, and more there all the time. They patrol a lot. They talk to people. The community knows not only the local police by uniform, but many times know them by name. A great example of this is Japan. Now, in Japan, policing is much more distributed geographically than it is in most countries. So every neighborhood seemingly has what's called a koban, which is just a very small, almost like a hut, but can be the size of, say, a small house, that police work out of. A small number of police are assigned to that koban, and they do patrol from there. They're there if a citizen needs help with a crime problem, or anything else for that matter. I remember, so getting personal a little bit here, when I was a very young child, 5, 6 years old, I lived in Japan for a couple years, and I remember the koban outside my house. I was just a little American boy, and they would give me little, like a little folded origami crane, or little toys and stuff, and they were just nice gentleman that worked in this weird hut-looking thing on the edge of my neighborhood. Um, and I'm sure if I had gotten lost, they would have helped me get back to my house. If I had fallen and hurt myself, they would have been known exactly where my parents lived and been able to go get them and tell them that I had been hurt. All those things. So this community policing is really developed around integrating the police in with the community, getting them to kind of understand the needs of the community, know the people of the community, um, and really kind of in lots of ways reflect the community, right? Now, the downside here is this requires a lot of trust. If the public is already in a place where they don't trust the police, this community policing style is going to be a lot less useful. Because if police don't trust, or if citizens don't trust the police to do the right thing, they're not going to tell them, oh, yeah, I saw, little Bobby down the street smoking marijuana last night, or when a crime happens, they're not going to want to tell the police what they saw. And once you've developed a very good community police relationship, this kind of policing style seems to be very, very, very successful. But if you don't already have that trust, it can be very difficult to implement this kind of community policing scheme. And it also kind of assumes that any given community is kind of homogenous, that everybody in the community thinks X is a problem and the police should start dealing with that, whether it's people smoking marijuana or prostitution or any of these other issues. Whereas in reality, communities a lot of times are very divided over different issues, right? If you're in a college town, half the neighborhood might really want a noise ordinance that says no parties after 10 p.m., but the other half of the community, usually the college students, think, no, we want to be able to party until 3, 4 in the morning. So communities aren't always as homogenous as community policing and the theory behind community policing might expect/want. Now, the other big policing style I'm going to discuss is zero tolerance policing. Now, zero tolerance policing was developed out of a theory called broken windows. And broken windows, I forgot the name of the people who came up with it, but essentially what broken windows, the name comes from the fact that in a city, kids, a lot of times, especially in more industrial areas, will throw a rock and break a window. And if that window is fixed relatively quickly, the number of broken windows happens, but very rarely. But if a kid throws a rock and breaks a window and it's not fixed fairly quickly, it's going to be really, really soon that all the windows in the entire building are broken. And the lesson there is, if you focus on the small stuff, every time a window is broken, if you fix it right then and there, then overall crime will go down. But if you let it go, if you let the small stuff go, if you let that broken window not get fixed, pretty soon you're going to have a whole ton of broken windows, i.e. a whole ton of crime, right? Now, this has worked in the past in very specific contexts, especially in situations where community policing is not an option. There's a big divide between the community and police. But it also has a lot of downsides because it can be used in kind of a nefarious way, right? If there is kind of a group of people that are seen as lesser, this can be used as an excuse to kind of discriminate against those groups, whether that's Jewish groups or Romani groups or African Americans or any kind of group that is traditionally seen as lesser in whatever community you're in. Police often will use this kind of policing style to focus nigh on exclusively on those groups because they think that's where most of the crime is coming from. And almost always they're wrong, but that doesn't prevent them from doing it. And the other problem here is it costs a lot. because you're arresting people and fining people and focusing on so much. You have to have more officers. Those officers have to write more tickets and arrest more people and house more people and book more people, and thus the courts have to deal with more people and corrections has to deal with more people. So it becomes very expensive. But again, in very specific contexts, in very specific situations, it's been shown to be fairly effective in reducing crime. Now, privatized policing. This means, i.e., we're going to pay a private company to do our policing job in this very specific situation. Private policing has seen a huge increase over the past few decades. It's gone from very rarely in very kind of small situations we would have these privatized police to now they're all over the place in a lot of countries. And they do a lot of different jobs. Everything from traffic enforcement to security at buildings to private investigation, private DNA analysis, all these different jobs that have kind of recently, traditionally been seen as the job of police are now being done by people that are being paid to do it. And there's obviously lots of issues there. If only the rich can afford privatized police, that means crime is just going to get even worse in the poor areas. Lots of other issues there. But that is kind of the trend in many places in the world. Now, anyway, I'm going to take a little bit of break, and we are going to be back for the second section of this, or the second part of this section, I should say. See you then.